Welcome back, Bobcats. Mr. Buckman here, and continuing our talk on government's role in the markets for resources and for goods and services. Now, there's one thing I actually didn't mention in the last video, and I would say one of the most obvious ways that a government would interact in the markets for resources and the markets for goods and services would be when they make something illegal, okay? So if you think about it, let's say the government, and they've done this, let's say they make something like alcohol illegal. Businesses can no longer sell it, and households can no longer consume it, okay? So this would be an example where they're taking a good and service, and they're just removing it from the market, okay? Likewise, you might have certain drugs that are illegal, okay? And also there are periods in time where certain resources, you can only hold a certain amount because they're scarce. During the Great Depression, for instance, there was a gold shortage and people were only allowed to own a certain amount of gold. So that would be kind of an example of the government interfering or influencing the markets for resources and goods and services, okay? But the first period of American history that I want to talk about, and talking about how the government comes into these markets, is what's known as the Gilded Age. Okay, this will be the first of the four periods of American history we're going to discuss. And when we hear this term, the Gilded Age, we're not going to really talk about what it means too much. You will learn about that in middle school. But just for reference, we mean it is referring to the U.S. economy during the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Okay? Now, this is right after the Civil War, and this is kind of when the United States really, really industrializes. And we have lots of rapid growth, okay? But what happens when you have all that rapid growth? You've got businesses and factories. You might have a lot of growth, but you might not have very many rules or regulations for what the workplace environment should be like, safety protections, or even wages. Who's allowed to work in the factories, okay? So lots of rapid economic growth, but not a lot of rules or regulations to monitor that rapid growth, okay? So let's talk about a few examples from the Gilded Age, okay? We've got our first example here would be the Pullman Strike, okay? And the Pullman Strike is a very famous historical event. In 1894, workers in Chicago went on strike, okay? Why would workers go on strike? Well, normally they would negotiate their wages in the market for resources. They would say, I want this much money per hour or per year. And the business might negotiate that with them. But these workers were unhappy with what the business was offering to pay them. So they went on strike. Now, a very tragic thing happens on this. The government intervenes and they side with the business, with the Pullman Company. President Grover Cleveland at that time is going to side with the Pullman Company, okay? And what happens is Cleveland sends in National Guard troops, actual federal soldiers, into Chicago. And unfortunately, during these strikes, 30 people are killed. These were people that were just trying to negotiate their wages for fair work, fair wages for fair work. And the government intervened here and actually stopped the strike in support of the company, killing 30 of those workers. I would say that this is an example of the government intervening in a bad way, okay? They're protecting the businesses, which they do need to do, but they also need to protect the workers, those people coming from households, okay? So I just mentioned that this was a strike, okay? But we need to clarify what a strike is. A strike is a method of negotiating wages. How does this work? It's actually quite simple. Workers stop working and businesses cannot produce goods and services. The production line stops. Without workers, it doesn't happen. This forces the business owners to think about the value of their workers and consider possibly giving them a higher wage. Okay? And this can be a very effective way to ask for more money at your job if you are organized. Okay? If you are organized. One person with a picket sign out there probably isn't going to get that far. Thousands probably will. We also have a very, very tragic situation at what's known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Sort of a funny name for this, but short skirts used to be called shirtwaists. That's all that is. Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Now, this was in 1911 in New York City. This was a multi-story factory. And in these times, what happened was these factories, these buildings did not have fire escapes built into them. And on top of that, business owners in some factories, they noticed that when workers were tired, they sometimes left the factory for a few minutes to take a quick break. Some of these business owners decided, I don't want my workers taking breaks. And they actually have locked doors to where you are not able to escape from the factory until the end of your shift. Now, I'm very happy that we don't have a situation like this now. It sounds like something where the business owner is just trying to get the most work out of their workers. But unfortunately, this creates a very dangerous situation for these people in New York City. What happens is we have a fire in a multi-story factory, which kills 146 people when there are no fire escapes to get out of that building. This will be, luckily though, a good situation for the government to intervene, in my opinion. The government responds by passing laws. What kind of laws? Laws that actually require safety measures. You need to have fire escapes. You might need to have fire alarms. And for certain, you cannot lock your doors and trap your workers inside of the factory to get more production out of them. Okay? So this would be an example of the government intervening in the market for resources in the sense that they are protecting workers. These would be costs for the businesses normally. Costs that this business was not paying for until the government stepped in. Okay? Another thing that the government steps in, and I think for good reason, is child labor. Okay, and you guys might have heard a little bit about this with the Industrial Revolution, and we will talk about this later on in social studies. But throughout the 19th century, you have children that are as young as 7 years of age, 7 years old, and they could work in factories. What kind of work was that like? Well, you can bet, we're talking about Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, it's going to be dangerous work. In fact, it was dangerous work with no protections. Okay, we just learned about how that place didn't have a fire escape. Imagine if we have 7-year-olds working in that situation as well. That's very tragic, okay? That's very tragic. And we want to give these children an opportunity to just have a childhood and not go straight into the workforce, okay? In 1924, the U.S. government finally begins regulating age requirements. And in most cases, they set 16 years of age for you to work full-time. But in special situations, like let's say that your parents you have one parent who's a dentist, the other parent runs the office. Well, you might be able to work front office over the summer, okay? Could they hire you at 13 years of age if you're their child? Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem. You're just kind of helping out with the family business. The government isn't going to tell you that a 13-year-old child of a dentist and an office manager could not work in that office, okay? But we don't want that 13-year-old going out on the streets and trying to get a job at Subway quite yet. They need to go to school instead, okay? So Pullman Strike, government intervenes when wages are trying to be negotiated. Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, the government intervenes to give more protections to workers, and also more protection to workers in the sense that we are going to not have children as workers anymore. Okay? So we got the Gilded Age. Stay tuned for the New Deal.